The Aeldari were not born, they were shaped by the primordial forces of the galaxy and by the careful interventions of higher beings. The precise details of their genesis remain obscured behind the veil of ancient millennia, but what remains consistent in all records is that the Aeldari emerged as a singularly advanced and psychically potent species. Their origin predates the rise of most sentient life in the galaxy, and their civilization had already reached interstellar sophistication by the time most human tribes had yet to master language. Though it is still debated whether the Old Ones had a direct hand in their creation, many records imply the Aeldari were part of the Old Ones' answer to the Necron threat. The Aeldari were designed to be a race of immense psychic sensitivity, perfectly adapted to traverse the immaterial realms of the warp and to utilize its energy in structured, controlled forms. Biologically, the Aeldari are tall and lithe, with average heights reaching over 2 meters. Their musculature is refined and efficient rather than bulky, allowing agility and reaction speed far beyond human norms. Skin tones vary subtly across their subcultures, from alabaster and pearl to pale violet or copper hues, with some showing faint bioluminescent patterns. Their lifespan under ideal conditions can exceed 5,000 years, though few ever reach their natural limit due to the galaxy's constant threats. Their senses are hyper-acute, especially sight and hearing, and they possess near-instinctual awareness of the warp's fluctuations. Unlike most species, the Aeldari have innate psychic resonance. Every member of the species, from the lowest civilian to the most elite warrior, contributes to the overall psychic echo that resonates through their collective cultural gestalt. The rise of the Aeldari Empire was a slow but deliberate process. Their mastery of the Webway, a vast interdimensional network, allowed them to expand without ever engaging with real space limitations. Their cities, immense, soaring constructs of psychoplastic architecture, floated in void space or were anchored within the Webway itself. Civilization was governed not by singular rulers, but by complex councils of seers, philosophers, warriors, and artists. The Aeldari placed spiritual and aesthetic perfection at the core of their social doctrine. Art was not decoration, but the medium of truth, and warfare was seen not as conquest, but as necessary discipline to maintain cosmic balance. Their society was stratified not by wealth, but by philosophical pursuit. Individuals would spend centuries mastering one path, be it the path of the artisan, the path of the seer, or the path of the warrior. This strict self-limitation prevented the emotional excesses that their psychic resonance could amplify. The warrior castes were among the most disciplined in the galaxy. Each aspect warrior followed a precise behavioral and martial doctrine. They would don ritual armor and embody a singular method of war, becoming living avatars of strategy, vengeance, or stealth. This compartmentalization allowed the Aeldari to remain internally stable, despite their extreme sensitivities. Military doctrine centered around precision, misdirection, and overwhelming psychic superiority. The Aeldari did not field massive ground assaults unless absolutely necessary. Their combat was surgical. Aspect warriors, guided by seers and supported by highly mobile grav tanks, would strike at command structures and key logistical points. Their machines, like the elegant Wave Serpent or the Swift Viper, were built with anti-gravitic tech and psychoplastic hulls that responded to thought and instinct. Wraith constructs, powered by soul stones containing the spirits of the dead, served as the elite heavy infantry. These constructs walked the battlefield with slow, reverent power, often as much a symbol of spiritual memory as a weapon. Leadership in the Empire was decentralized but spiritually aligned. Farseers, powerful psychers who could glimpse into the strands of fate, formed the primary guiding voices of their civilization. While civilian affairs were often handled by artisan and political guilds, military decisions rested in the hands of warlocks and autarchs, each representing different facets of past paths. Conflict was often resolved not through majority rule, but through divination and consensus among those who had walked the longest paths. It was not democracy as humans understood it, but a meritocracy of spiritual discipline. Leadership in the Empire was decentralized but spiritually aligned. Farseers, powerful psykers who could glimpse into the strands of fate, formed the primary guiding voices of their civilization. While civilian affairs were often handled by artisan and political guilds, military decisions rested in the hands of warlocks and autarchs, each representing different facets of past paths. Conflict was often resolved not through majority rule, but through divination and consensus among those who had walked the longest paths. It was not democracy as humans understood it, but a meritocracy of spiritual discipline. Technology within the Aeldari Empire was more than functional. It was alive, psychically bonded and aesthetically flawless. Machines were grown, not assembled, shaped from Wraith bone, a psycho-reactive material that could channel warp energy safely. Interfaces responded to intent rather than physical input. Weapons like the shuriken catapult used gravitic acceleration to unleash monomolecular discs at hypervelocity. Vehicles hovered without friction. Constructs fought with ghost-guided grace. At every level, their tech reflected the philosophical harmony of mind, matter, and energy. Famous individuals and units from the Empire's zenith have since become almost mythical. Asumen, the first of the Phoenix Lords, carved the template of the warrior paths. Jane Zar, Fugan, Kavendrus, all became living gods of war. The Craftworlds, vast vessels of cultural preservation, bore names like Biel-Tan, Ulthwé, and Saim Han, each embodying distinct worldviews. The avatar of Cain, a shard of a sundered god, would rise in times of need, its molten form rampaging across enemy lines as the physical incarnation of Aeldari wrath. Yet none of these forces were ever used carelessly. Every war was a matter of existential balance. To act prematurely could fracture the threads of fate and invite calamity. As the Empire expanded, so too did its spiritual and ethical paradoxes. The Aeldari became increasingly self-absorbed, indulging in extremes of sensation and thought. While their paths had once kept them in balance, growing numbers began to abandon discipline. Pleasure cults, excess sects, and nihilistic enclaves appeared across major cultural centres. Over time, the Empire transformed from a civilization of precision and harmony into one of indulgence and psycho-spiritual entropy. This shift was gradual yet catastrophic in scale, and at its apex, this collapse of restraint would produce a psychic scream loud enough to tear open the warp. But before that final calamity, the Aeldari still stood as the most dominant force in the galaxy. Their rituals bound the stars, their fleets moved in silence between realities, and their philosophers debated fate not as concept, but as structure. Their divisions, whether artisan, seer, warrior, or outcast, remained internally stable, their conflicts resolved through psychic consensus and ritual duels. Logistics were handled with astonishing grace. The Webway provided near-instant transport of goods, knowledge, and forces across light years. No other species, not even the burgeoning human colonies, posed a significant threat to their dominion. And yet their downfall would come not from without, but from within. The very sensitivity that elevated them above all others would become the echo chamber of their own destruction. The next era in their history would not be shaped by conquest or diplomacy, but by screams, millions of voices turned inward, collapsing the fabric of their civilization in a moment of unspeakable psychic violence. On the eve of their empire's peak, the Aeldari lived lives so advanced and stable that hardship had become an alien concept to them. Disease, famine, and material deprivation had been eradicated millennia prior. Through a combination of psychic healing, automated labour, and complete control over their environment, the Aeldari no longer faced survival struggles. Every need was met instantly. Leisure, art, philosophy, and exploration had become not privileges but expectations. Yet with this abundance came stagnation. The paths once designed to maintain order and prevent psychic instability began to be seen as burdensome. The more decadent elements of society rejected discipline and pursued unfiltered experience. In abandoning the paths, many Aeldari unlocked forms of psychic excess that fed into their innermost desires, unchecked and unmoderated. The social structure fractured into two main directions. On one side were those who remained loyal to the structured path system, retreating into isolated colonies or orbital structures. These would eventually become the modern Craftworld Aeldari. On the other side were those who embraced the collapse, a philosophy of indulgence through sensation, raw emotion, and transgression. These groups built pleasure cities within the Webway and filled them with endless arenas, cathedrals of excess, and psychically amplified temples. Acts of suffering and ecstasy became indistinguishable. Within these core worlds, the psychic resonance of the Aeldari began to reverberate into the immaterium in increasingly volatile patterns. The behaviour of these pleasure cults was not merely physical but metaphysical. As their indulgence grew more perverse, they attracted entities in the warp. For the Aeldari, whose very emotions were amplified by their psychic nature, each act of depravity echoed across the immaterium like a scream. Yet within the Empire there were no warnings taken seriously. The seer councils, long respected for their interpretations of fate, found their visions clouded or ignored. Prophecies were dismissed as archaic paranoia. Only the most isolated worlds took these threats seriously, and by then the psychic inertia was irreversible. The military arms of the Empire began to decay during this period. Armies were reduced, fleets repurposed for exploration or ceremonial parades. The aspect shrines grew quiet, as many left the warrior paths entirely. War was seen as a crude necessity of less civilized times. Some of the more radical factions within the Empire even advocated dismantling the warrior traditions altogether. Only a few Craftworlds maintained active martial orders, and even these were viewed as fanatical relics of a bygone age. This pacification left the Empire structurally vulnerable, but the Aeldari had grown so inward-focused that the concept of external threat seemed irrelevant. Technology evolved in parallel with their moral decline. Psychoplastic materials were no longer shaped for precision or utility, but for aesthetic expression. Entire cities were built as sculptures of living memory, echoing thoughts and moods rather than serving function. Wraithbone constructs were imbued with artificial sensations, so that users could feel the architecture emotionally. Weapons became rare, and those that remained were often ritualistic or ornamental. War machines sat dormant in museums. The machines that did see use were redesigned for entertainment or hedonistic function, such as psychically responsive theatres or sensory immersion chambers. Still, beneath the excess, there remained a haunting sense of anticipation. Many Aeldari reported dreams of collapse, visions of screaming stars and dark gods rising from the depths of the soul. Psychic echoes became increasingly unstable across the Webway. Some pleasure cults actively sought to contact the source of this disturbance, interpreting it as the ultimate transcendence. They built altars not to any known god, but to the void itself. Rituals were held where pain and pleasure blurred, and participants tried to evoke deeper psychic experiences than ever before. Some succeeded, but what they reached was not enlightenment, it was hunger. Key figures during this period varied in notoriety and alignment. Asdrubal Vecht, later known as the founder of the Dark City Commorrug's modern hierarchy, began his rise during these years. At the time, he was little more than a visionary among the degenerate archons of the Webway, but he foresaw the collapse and began consolidating power. On the other side, figures like Eldrad Ulthran attempted to steer the Craftworlds towards safety. A master farseer of Ulthway, Eldrad gathered prophecies and visions that warned of a coming disaster, but even he underestimated its scale. His calls for retreat into the Webway or exile from the core Aeldari worlds were met with dismissal or outright mockery. The internal rituals of the Aeldari, once intended to maintain balance and control, were corrupted into parodies. Seer rituals became games of ego. Warrior rites turned into blood sports for amusement. Religious ceremonies devolved into performances. The reverence once given to Cain, their war god, was replaced with chaotic worship of sensation itself. Temples of Cain fell into disuse, their statues desecrated or reinterpreted as symbols of carnal rage. Lesser gods like Isha and Lilith were forgotten, their names invoked only in hollow poetry or repurposed for pleasure cults. Divisions within Aeldari society deepened. The outcasts, those who rejected all formal structure, wandered the stars without purpose or anchor. Some joined pirate fleets, others became hermits on distant worlds. The Exodites, who had long since abandoned the Empire to live on maiden worlds in harmony with nature, watched the cause decline from afar. They had no illusions about what was coming. Some Craftworlds attempted to send envoys to warn others, but their messengers were killed, enslaved, or assimilated into cults. Isolation became survival. The psychic behaviours of the Aeldari shifted dramatically. What was once a symphony of disciplined mental clarity became a chaotic torrent of unchecked emotion. The warp, once subtly shaped by their thoughts, began to echo back twisted reflections of their desires. This feedback loop intensified exponentially. Farseers began to lose control. Telepathy and precognition were no longer reliable. Seers spoke in gibberish or fell into endless fugue states. Entire Webway nodes began to flicker in and out of phase, as if reacting to the psychic storms forming within the Aeldari soul. In this unstable period, even the Wraith constructs began to malfunction. Spirit stones, once the anchors of the dead, became unpredictable. Some Wraith lords attacked their allies without warning, others simply shut down, their souls refusing to awaken. The afterlife the Aeldari had crafted, where souls were preserved and protected, was beginning to fray. The idea of death returned as a real and final concept. For a race built on avoiding mortality, this realization was quietly horrifying. The few remaining military leaders, autarchs who had maintained their warrior discipline, found themselves facing an impossible dilemma. They could not initiate a civil war against their own people without risking even greater psychic instability. Yet standing by meant letting their culture collapse. Some began plans for evacuation. Entire Craftworlds disengaged from the Webway and set course for deep space. Biel-Tan, known for its martial pride, went silent. Others, like a Latok, embraced isolationism and refused all communication. Ulthwé alone remained near the core, attempting to delay the inevitable. Despite these efforts, the momentum of psychic excess could no longer be slowed. The warp became louder, more turbulent, and increasingly sentient. Unseen by the Aeldari, the raw emotion they had poured into the Immaterium was coalescing. This wasn't a metaphor or a myth, it was a literal genesis. Deep within the warp, a new god was forming, not created by faith but by emotion, not shaped by prayer but by indulgence, a being of lust, excess, desire, and suffering. It had no name, because it did not yet exist, but its birth was imminent, and its cry would become the defining moment of the Aeldari's history. In a single moment, the Aeldari Empire ceased to exist, not through conquest or natural disaster, but through a metaphysical event that shattered reality itself. The excesses of the Aeldari, millions of voices feeding the warp with unrelenting desire and transgression, culminated in the catastrophic birth of a new chaos entity. In the warp, where thought shapes reality, the collective indulgence of an entire species had woven together a consciousness so vast and singular that it tore into existence. In the year 30,000, in the final years of Millennia 30, this god awakened with a scream so loud that it annihilated not only the psychic fabric of the Aeldari, but the physical integrity of their worlds. This entity would come to be known as Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess. Its awakening was not symbolic. It manifested in a psychic shockwave that instantly obliterated the core Aeldari worlds. Entire planets, civilizations that had stood for millions of years, were consumed in moments. The psychic explosion unraveled every soul within range. Those closest to the event did not die in pain or fire. They were unmade, their existence devoured in a manner that left no physical or spiritual trace. The god's birth cry echoed through the Webway, tearing its corridors and rupturing sealed gates. Webway nodes collapsed. Cities folded into warp rifts, and protective wards detonated under the strain. The physical location where this event occurred became what is now known as the Eye of Terror, a massive warp rift in the galaxy's structure, where the immaterium bleeds into real space. The eye is not a metaphor, it is a literal hole in the fabric of the galaxy. What was once the heart of the Aeldari Empire is now a roiling storm of madness, where time and physics break down and chaos reigns unchallenged. Within it, the remnants of pleasure cults were twisted into demons, their bodies fused with warp essence. These survivors did not remain Aeldari in any true sense. They became something else, twisted, immortal, addicted to sensation and cruelty. These would eventually form the foundation of what is now known as the Drukhari and the demon kin of Slaanesh. The Aeldari who survived did so by distance or preparation. The Craftworlds, massive self-sustaining vessels that had broken away from the core worlds, were spared by virtue of isolation, yet even they were not immune to the consequences. The psychic shockwave killed billions across the Webway. Most Craftworlds lost all contact with one another. Many drifted in silence, unable to navigate the warp as it destabilized around them. Some, like Ynnead and Lugganath, survived mostly intact. Others, like Xandros and Kyrus, were never heard from again. The survivors found themselves adrift in a galaxy that no longer recognized them. The Aeldari were no longer dominant. They were a shattered, nearly extinct race. In the aftermath, the survivors adapted with grim urgency. Farseers, shaken by their failure to foresee the catastrophe, restructured their roles. They became archivists of fate, obsessed with unravelling the remaining strands of destiny. The warrior castes reawakened, no longer ceremonial but vital. The paths were reinstated with absolute rigour. No deviation was tolerated. The Aeldari now walked the paths not for balance, but for survival. Any who strayed were at risk of psychic instability, and through that the attention of Slaanesh. This new discipline became their salvation and their burden. One of the most fundamental changes was spiritual. With the birth of Slaanesh, the Aeldari lost their afterlife. No longer could souls pass peacefully into the warp. Instead, they were hunted. Upon death, Aeldari souls would be devoured by Slaanesh unless protected. To prevent this, the survivors developed spirit stones, psycho-reactive crystals worn on the body. These stones captured the soul upon death and prevented it from entering the warp. Collected stones were then embedded into the infinity circuit of each Craftworld, a psycho-spiritual network where the dead could rest, contribute to decision-making, or be called upon in times of need. The military traditions also evolved. Aspect shrines grew in number and complexity. Each warrior walked a specific path, mastering a single mode of combat. Striking scorpions, dire avengers, fire dragons, each represented a distilled principle of warfare. The Phoenix Lords, ancient warriors who had survived the fall by virtue of their psychic resonance and armour, returned to guide the aspect paths. Their identities were not singular. Each could possess successors through soul transfer, creating continuity across millennia. Asurman, Janezar, and Fugan became symbols not only of war, but of cultural memory. The Wraith constructs, once ceremonial, became a core part of Aeldari defence. Fallen warriors were interred within psychoplastic shells, Wraith Lords, Wraith Guard, Wraith Knights, and deployed in battle under the guidance of Spirit Seers. This was not without cost. The soul's integration into a machine was traumatic, often leading to confusion or existential torment. Yet it was a necessary compromise. The dead could still serve, and in some cases, they remembered enough of who they were to fight with precision and purpose. Among the most radical changes was the reconfiguration of the Webway. Access became heavily restricted. The routes that once allowed instant travel across the Empire were sealed. The Black Library, a secret archive built within a hidden node of the Webway, became the greatest repository of forbidden knowledge in the galaxy. Maintained by the Harlequins and protected by the enigmatic laughing god Sigurach, the Black Library housed records of the Fall, the nature of Slaanesh, and methods of resisting chaos. Only the most trusted, or the most desperate were granted access. The Exodites, long forgotten, re-emerged as a parallel survival strategy. They had left the Empire long before the fall, settling on maiden worlds where they adopted a simpler, agrarian life in harmony with psychic ecosystems. Their worlds were protected by world spirits, collective consciousnesses that absorbed Aeldari souls upon death. Though technologically primitive by Aeldari standards, the Exodites had survived intact. Their presence reminded the others of what had been lost, and what might still be preserved. In contrast, those who had survived within the darker regions of the Webway took a different path. The Drukhari, or Dark Aeldari, rejected the path system entirely. They survived not through discipline, but through predation. By torturing others and harvesting pain, they could stave off Slaanesh's hunger. Comera, the vast and nightmarish city within the Webway, became their sanctuary and hunting ground. Ruled by archons, homunculi covens, and witch cults, the Drukhari existed in a state of ceaseless cruelty. For them, survival was power, and morality a discarded relic. Though the Empire was gone, remnants of its legacy remained. Craftworlds became mobile fortresses of culture and resistance. Each maintained a unique interpretation of Aeldari heritage. Biel-Tan sought to restore the Empire through military conquest. Ulthwé positioned itself as a psychic bulwark against chaos. Saimhan embraced wild mobility and tribal warfare. Alatok cultivated stealth and exile. No two Craftworlds agreed on the path forward, yet all agreed on one thing: the past could not be reclaimed, only endured. Psychologically, the Aeldari had changed forever. No longer the confident masters of the galaxy, they now lived in a state of melancholic vigilance. Every decision was weighed against the potential to draw Slaanesh's gaze. Every birth, every death, every war, it all occurred under the shadow of the Prince of Excess. Their art became somber, their songs filled with longing. Yet they persisted, because to die carelessly was to be devoured, and to survive was to honour the memory of what they had once been. In terms of logistics, the Aeldari had lost nearly everything. The industrial base of the Empire was gone. Resource extraction had to be cautious, often relying on hidden moons or asteroid fields. Shipbuilding was confined to Craftworld docks. Population growth was slow, with reproduction tightly regulated. Each new life was a risk and a responsibility. Children were raised with psychic training from infancy. There was no room for failure. Every Aeldari, from birth to death, carried the weight of a fallen civilization. Yet amidst this darkness, a strange resilience formed. The Aeldari had stared into the abyss and survived. Their minds were sharper, their purpose clearer. They no longer sought to dominate the galaxy, but they would not surrender it either. They became guardians of knowledge, wielders of fate, and reluctant prophets of decline. And though their empire was dust, their legacy endured in every psychic whisper that crossed the stars. The first official Imperial records acknowledging the Aeldari were not based on discovery, but on confrontation. By the time humanity had begun its expansion during the Great Crusade in the 31st millennium, the Aeldari had already been a galactic presence for millions of years. However, the Administratum did not initially recognize them as the remnants of a once galactic empire. Early field reports categorized them as anomalous xenos with advanced technology and erratic behavior patterns. According to the earliest surviving Imperial logs, the first known military encounter between the Aeldari and the Great Crusade occurred in the year 30,000, during the Ulanor compliance campaigns. A detachment of Imperial forces investigating unexplored star systems encountered resistance in a cluster later identified as under the protection of Craftworld Alatok. The Aeldari did not respond through formal diplomacy or large-scale defense. Rather, a series of surgical strikes dismantled the lead elements of the expeditionary fleet. The fleet's Vox channels were overwhelmed by psychic interference, and several vessels suffered internal sabotage through unknown means. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded anomalous sensor echoes consistent with Webway activity, though the term had not yet been formalized. That incident led to the issuing of precautionary protocols when dealing with Xenos presenting instantaneous troop movement and impossible manoeuvring. Subsequent engagements painted a picture of a non-monolithic Xenos force. While the Orcs presented predictable aggression, and the Tau later exhibited a clear expansionist drive, the Aeldari defied easy categorization. Administratum surveys noted that no consistent strategy could be applied to them. In some instances, Aeldari craft would silently observe Imperial activity without intervening. In others, they would destroy entire outposts with clinical precision, vanish without explanation, and then leave the region untouched for decades. Their refusal to engage in sustained campaigns or establish permanent strongholds frustrated conventional understanding. Initial reports referred to them as ghost warriors and witch kin, with many officers suspecting demonic influence. It was only after interrogating rogue traders with decades of Deep Void experience that the name Eldar entered formal Imperial documentation. That name was eventually standardized to Aeldari under Order Classificatio M39.45, though usage of both persists in non-military texts. The Adeptus Mechanicus became particularly interested in Aeldari ruins found on dead maiden worlds and Webway breach sites. These structures often emitted residual warp signatures, psychoplastic residue, and non-standard gravitic readings. One recovered site on the planet designated S102 contained fragmentary pictograms etched into psychically responsive stone. When exposed to low-frequency energy pulses, these markings projected visual data interpreted as historical memories. Although degraded, these echoes depicted beings resembling modern Aeldari engaged in both combat and spiritual rites. The Order Xenos initially deemed the site a chaos-related threat, but Mechanicus Magos from Riza argued for preservation and deeper study. Unfortunately, the site was destroyed during a subsequent warp surge. The full potential of that discovery remains undocumented, but its transmission logs remain archived under Mechanicus Secure File D731V. Strategic documentation across the Segmentum Obscurus and Segmentum Ultima records numerous planetary campaigns where Aeldari involvement occurred without prior warning or pattern. On Chimera Prime in the year 32,000, an entire Astra Militarum battle group vanished mid-campaign. Forensic data indicated that no massed assault occurred. However, power cores were removed, command staff suffered lethal neural trauma, and supply lines were severed with untraceable precision. Surveillance cogitators recovered from a forward operations dome captured only brief footage of humanoid figures moving at extreme speed and deploying shimmering constructs that phased in and out of visibility. The surviving records were sent to the Administratum's high-threat archives and were labelled with the classification Xenos Threat Pattern Designation Spectral Host. At the core of Administratum confusion was the apparent inconsistency of Aeldari behaviour. In the late 32nd millennium, Aeldari forces were documented aiding an Imperial research outpost on the moon of Carthuriel. The reason remains unknown. They eliminated a Tyranid splinter group that had breached the research dome's perimeter, deployed unknown biological suppressants, and then departed without communication. Tech priests inspecting the scene found Aeldari constructs embedded with rare biomechanical interfaces. These were swiftly seized and quarantined by the Order Xenos. To date, their function remains undetermined. This incident, while isolated, triggered internal re-evaluation of Aeldari motives. The Aeldari were not classified as openly hostile but as strategic wildcards. Their goals remained opaque, their methods inscrutable. Administratum historians later compiled an internal document known as the Xenos Cultural Continuity Hypothesis, which posited that the Aeldari were not a scattered race, but a fractured cultural remnant. This hypothesis, based on shared linguistic markers found across recovered ruins, postulated that Craftworld Aeldari, Exodites, and the so-called Dark Kin of Comera were all descendants of a singular empire. The theory was not widely circulated, in part due to resistance from ecclesiarchical elements who feared acknowledging a Xenos race with such deep galactic roots. Even so, the document became foundational to Ordo Xenos briefings and Imperial Navy engagement protocols involving Aeldari forces. the existence of multiple subcultures with divergent ethical frameworks was accepted as fact by the early 34th millennium. Documentation from this era also established that Aeldari military assets could not be engaged by conventional force distribution. Strikecraft from Biel-Tan exhibited mobility that exceeded known limits of Imperial sensor tracking. Their deployment methods, suspected to involve Webway-based vectors, allowed them to bypass planetary defense networks entirely. Administratum calculations estimated that a single Craftworld deployment could neutralize an Astra Militarum regiment with less than 30% active field presence. They accomplished this not through brute strength, but by targeted elimination of command assets, psychic suppression, and environmental manipulation. These methods earned them the classification nonlinear warfare threat in the Segmentum Tempestus Combat Doctrine Manual 35. One of the most thoroughly documented Imperial campaigns involving the Aeldari occurred on the Forge world of Durin Kell in the year 35,000. The world had suffered periodic raids by Drukhari forces, leading the Imperial Guard and Skitarii to initiate a prolonged defense campaign. Unexpectedly, forces from Craftworld Ulthway appeared in the system and began neutralizing Dark Eldar raiding parties. They made no effort to communicate with Imperial Command. Their warriors ignored warning Vox transmissions and bypassed defense networks without triggering auto-responses. Despite their assistance, Imperial casualties rose due to mistaken identifications and return fire. The Ulthway forces eventually withdrew, and their last recorded action was the destruction of a hidden Webway gate buried beneath the planet's equatorial ridge. The site was later quarantined by the Inquisition. This event, and others like it, led to the issuance of Adeptus Administratum Memorandum 478 Theta on the presence of allied Xenos forces. The memorandum outlined criteria for temporary non-engagement with Aeldari forces, provided they were not directly hostile. However, it included the explicit warning that all Aeldari contact was to be treated as a temporary anomaly, not an alliance. They were to be avoided whenever possible, and no assumptions made regarding their intentions. Even within cooperative frameworks, the Administratum noted that Aeldari long-term objectives likely diverge from human interests in irreconcilable ways. By the dawn of the 36th millennium, Administratum consensus accepted that the Aeldari were a dwindling force in the galaxy, but one still capable of great precision and catastrophic retaliation. Their appearances became rarer and their engagements more targeted. Rumours filtered through rogue trader channels that some Craftworlds had begun collaborating with Inquisitors, while others continued to attack Imperial colonies without provocation. Official records, however, show no formal treaties or acknowledgements. The Aeldari, as far as the Administratum was concerned, remained Xenos of unknown origin and unquantifiable risk. Their ancient empire was gone, but its survivors still haunted the stars. By the middle of the 36th millennium, Administratum documentation regarding the Aeldari expanded significantly. As the Imperium's frontier expanded into more ancient regions of space, more frequent collisions occurred between human colonists and Aeldari forces, both Craftworld and otherwise. Initially, these events were logged as isolated anomalies, but the pattern grew undeniable. The Aeldari were no longer simply defending dormant ruins or intercepting specific threats. They were actively maneuvering across Imperial space with precise timing, often in ways that implied advanced predictive capability. Many within the Divisio Militaris suspected their strategic foresight came from long-range auguries or warp sight, a theory that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica would later support through data gathered from sanctioned psychers exposed to Aeldari presence. One of the most widely studied examples of Aeldari involvement during this period is the Battle of Zias Tan, fought in the year 36,312. Located within the Segmentum Pacificus, the planet was a developing agri-world vital to sustaining nearby forge installations. Without warning, a fully mechanized Biel-Tan strike force descended on the surface, targeting a colony that was days away from full orbital tether deployment. Despite the lack of provocation, The Bealtan war hosts avoided civilian infrastructure and focused entirely on a subterranean structure beneath one of the polar ranges. When Astra Militarum reinforcements arrived 4 days later, the Aeldari withdrew without engaging them directly. Forensic investigation of the polar site uncovered a sealed vault of unknown Xenos origin, with inscriptions partially matching those found on Exodite worlds. The Adeptus Mechanicus redacted all further findings. Administratum records mark the incident as Containment Breach Prevention Operation, non-imperial involvement required. Shortly after Zeustan, multiple Forge worlds, particularly those located within former Aeldari Empire territory, began experiencing what were termed phase displacement raids. These events involved extremely short-duration incursions in which no more than 2 or 3 Aeldari units would appear, seize a single artifact, destroy any localized data logs, and vanish within minutes. In all cases, the raids occurred immediately before the site's official reclassification for wider exploitation. The Mechanicus hypothesized that many of these locations housed residual Webway connections or lost psychic constructs that the Aeldari were attempting to recover. The Administratum, however, treated these incidents as premeditated acts of espionage and expanded the existing Aeldari cultural asset seizure dossier. While these raids caused few casualties, the precision with which the Aeldari operated and their awareness of specific Imperial schedules suggested an intelligence network beyond the Imperium's reach. The 37th millennium introduced an even more complex layer of Imperial Aeldari interaction: prophecy-based conflict. Multiple recorded engagements occurred not because of present threats, but because the Aeldari believed that allowing an event to proceed would lead to catastrophic consequences for their race. A famous instance occurred on the world of Darvan 6, a minor colony in the Segmentum Tempestus. During its terraforming process, an Aeldari strike force from Craftworld Aeldari appeared without warning, destroyed the orbital command station, and withdrew. The survivors reported strange auditory hallucinations, flickers of ghostly images, and one instance of what Imperial clerics later claimed was a false vision of saintly rebuke. The reason for the attack was discovered decades later, when inquisitorial excavation teams unearthed a sealed portal, heavily engraved with Aeldari markings and corrupted by warp taint. It is believed that Ulthwé struck to prevent the Imperium from unknowingly unleashing an ancient demon vault. The colony was later sterilized under exterminatus-level orders. This marked one of the first formal recognitions by the Ordo Xenos that Aeldari aggression could be protective in nature, albeit miscommunicated and tactically opaque. Throughout the 37th and 38th millennia, Administratum intelligence struggled to reconcile the fragmented identities of the Aeldari subfactions. For example, a military campaign on the fringes of the Ultima Segmentum identified a Drukhari raiding force retreating into the same Webway network later accessed by Bealtan war hosts. While both factions avoided direct contact with each other, neither interfered with the other's objectives. This further validated the cultural divergence model previously posited in internal Divisio Historica forums. The model suggested that Craftworld and Dark Aeldari maintained limited but strategically aligned interests, especially regarding Webway security and artifact preservation. However, because Drukhari raids often involved mass civilian abductions and high levels of psychic trauma, the Ecclesiarchy blocked any public mention of potential Aeldari unity. Imperial citizens were to regard all Aeldari as hostile regardless of apparent action. By the 39th millennium, the frequency of large-scale Aeldari engagements had decreased, but their impact had not. One of the most devastating events on record was the fall of Ynnead, occurring in the late 39th millennium during a Tyranid hive fleet incursion. Though not an Imperial campaign, Administratum observatories and rogue trader logs captured the conflict in real time. Ynnead, one of the largest surviving craft worlds, suffered catastrophic losses defending itself against hive fleet Kraken. Over 90% of its population was killed or transferred into Wraith constructs. Although the Imperium did not intervene, later analysis by the Ordo Xenos used the Ynnead defense as a case study in effective anti-Tyranid tactics. More significantly, Mechanicus analysts speculated that the Aeldari's ability to resurrect and mobilize their dead into combat was a concept worth exploring through necromechanic systems, leading to restricted projects within Mars-based think engines. These findings were classified under Mechanicus file chain Red Crucible. In the 40th millennium, as the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, Aeldari presence surged across dozens of war zones. Administratum documents note a marked shift in their behaviour, correlating with the sudden appearance of a new Aeldari faction known as the Ynnari. Though information was scarce, what could be verified was that members from both Craftworld and Commorragh societies had begun unifying under a shared religious doctrine involving the god Ynnead, the Aeldari deity of the dead previously regarded as myth or philosophical metaphor. The rise of the Ynnari was particularly notable for the resurrection of ancient figures such as the Phoenix Lord Jane Zar and the radical warrior known as Ivrain, whose presence triggered massive psychic fluctuations. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica recorded warp pulses originating from Ynnari war hosts that temporarily silenced demonic activity within a 10 light-year radius, an effect previously unseen from any Xenos faction. The Administratum's response to the emergence of the Ynnari was fragmented. Some viewed this development as a destabilizing power shift within Aeldari society, while others saw the possibility of a new alignment forming between rival factions. What could not be denied was that the Ynnari operated differently. They were more visible, more direct in battle, and more likely to issue warnings to Imperial commanders. On several occasions, they even offered tactical assistance against Chaos incursions, though the true motives remained unclear. Due to these anomalies, the High Lords of Terror ordered the creation of an internal monitoring cell under the Ordo Xenos named Cassandra Protocol, whose sole purpose was to track and compile Ynari-related data from Battlefront Psyker reports and Mechanicus Archeo scans. By the closing years of the 41st millennium, Administratum cartography teams confirmed that at least 12 Craftworlds remained active, with dozens of smaller outposts, Exodite settlements, and Commorragh portals still unaccounted for. The true scale of the Aeldari presence remained impossible to calculate. While their numbers had clearly declined from pre-fall levels, they demonstrated logistical agility and force concentration far beyond what their apparent population would suggest. Theories circulated within select Adeptus Mechanicus circles that the Aeldari may possess unknown cloning or temporal manipulation technologies. These claims were dismissed officially, but continue to circulate in encrypted Skolum logs. Despite centuries of observation, one constant remained. The Aeldari do not operate by Imperial logic. Their every move, every silence, and every engagement is filtered through strands of fate imperceptible to human minds. To the Administratum, this made them untrustworthy. To the Inquisition, it made them potentially invaluable. But to the average Imperial citizen, whose world might burn or be saved by their hand without explanation, they remain ghosts from a time before mankind, carving paths the Imperium can neither predict nor control. Among the earliest officially sanctioned campaigns involving open warfare between the Imperium and the Aeldari, the Griffin conflict of 33,000, year 106, remains one of the most frequently cited in military education across the Segmentum Tempestus. The Mechanicus had initiated colonization protocols on Griffona 9, unaware that the site was once a former maiden world seeded with an ancient world spirit. When colonist terraforming began disrupting native biomechanical flora, Craftworld Aeldari launched an unannounced strike, disabling orbital tethers and deploying ground forces in a precision assault against generator hubs. Although the Mechanicus retaliated with Skitarii legions and Onager warbands, their command infrastructure was neutralized in the opening hour. The battle lasted 4 days, ending only after an Adeptus Astartes rapid response team from the Storm Falcons chapter arrived and forced a strategic Aeldari withdrawal. Despite the Aeldari departure, the world's ecology collapsed shortly after, and all attempts to re-terraform the surface failed. Administratum analysis concluded that the Aeldari goal had not been conquest or extermination, but containment. Griffona 9 was later abandoned and classified under Contagion Index Blue 15. Xenos spiritual contamination. The most devastating Imperial defeat attributed directly to Aeldari action occurred during the Marledon offensive in 34,000, year 912, in which the Mechanicus Forge world of Marledon Beta was entirely sterilized. A fleet from Craftworld Aeldari intercepted a Mechanicus excavation operation attempting to extract and study a world spirit fragment beneath the crust. The operation was sanctioned by the Ordo Xenos, but evidently misjudged the scale of Aeldari sensitivity. Without warning, Aeldari deployed its full war host. Over the span of 5 standard days, more than 30,000 Skitarii were killed, 3 forged citadels were rendered inoperative, and the orbital dockyards were obliterated. The Aeldari destroyed only Mechanicus infrastructure, deliberately bypassing refugee camps and non-military zones. Although a second wave of reinforcements managed to evacuate key personnel, Marledon Beta itself was rendered inert, its data cores stripped, and its reactor arrays dismantled. Administratum classification lists the battle as a total site denial action, while internal Ordo Xenos commentary described it as a surgical extermination with ethical restrictions. Not all Aeldari interventions ended in success. In 35,000, year 420, the Calyx Rift incursion saw Craftworld Aeldari attempt to halt an Imperial colonization push toward the eastern fringe. Believing a dormant Necron tomb complex existed beneath the Calyx planetary cluster, the Aeldari launched a first strike operation aimed at disrupting Imperial mining and construction. However, the Imperium had already deployed multiple Astartes chapters to secure the region, including the Crimson Fists and Red Talons. In a rare instance of sustained direct engagement, the Aeldari were repelled after a 12-day conflict marked by orbital duels, coordinated planetfall drops, and several failed psychic assaults. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the Calyx cluster was successfully fortified. Years later, Necron activity did emerge in the system, validating the Aeldari's concern. Nevertheless, the Administratum recorded the incident as an Imperial victory and used it to justify future fortifications across the entire fringe corridor. From 36,000 onward, several campaigns recorded intermittent Aeldari participation that aligned them against common Imperial enemies. One such incident occurred during the Cadian Gate disruption, following a Chaos incursion in year 36,382. During the battle for the orbital defences around Cadia Secundus, an Ulthway intervention force materialised via the Webway, and proceeded to eliminate a traitor Titan battalion operating outside the perimeter. Although Imperial forces initially responded with hostility, the Aeldari did not return fire and withdrew once the threat was neutralised. Transmissions from the Ulthway Farseer presence were intercepted and translated post-engagement. They contained only a single phrase: "Fate defends this gate, for now." The Administratum filed the report as an incidental alignment with non-compliant Xenos assets. It would not be the last time Aeldari forces appeared to guard Imperial holdings against chaos with no request for recognition. The Administratum also records the presence of Ynnead forces in events such as the Castle Forge raids, a series of flash conflicts between year 41,920 and year 41,925. These engagements were remarkable in that they involved joint operations between Craftworld units, Drukhari mercenaries, and Ynnari leaders under the banner of Ynnead. In several instances, Imperial logistics vessels were spared, while Chaos-aligned pirates and rogue Mechanicus data cults were targeted. While these actions were not officially recognised by the Imperium, data from recovered pick captures and sensor records confirmed the presence of Ivrain and the Vizarch, 2 known Ynnari leaders. The battles resulted in the destruction of 8 rogue forged spires and the recovery of an STC fragment that had been stolen during the Dark Mechanicum's internal uprising. Administratum analysts believed the Aeldari's goal was to prevent the spread of chaos-infected technology rather than aid the Imperium directly. Nevertheless, the incident became one of the few examples of an indirect Xenos action benefiting the broader strategic picture of the Imperium. Imperial defeat at the hands of the Aeldari is rarely due to brute force. Instead, most setbacks occur through asymmetrical engagement. One example, often referenced in Segmentum's solar military academies, is the death of Strategos Mercan, whose Crusade fleet was ambushed in 41,000, year 187. The Aeldari, believed to be from Craftworlds Saim Han, struck in a layered attack pattern, targeting the fleet's navigation relays, astropathic choir sanctums and command decks simultaneously. Mercan's flagship was disabled within minutes, and his forces fell into disarray. The Aeldari did not pursue the fleeing remnants. Instead, they destroyed a single lunar relay station and vanished. The Imperium never learned the reason for this action, but subsequent monitoring revealed the station had been repurposed by Alpha Legion sleeper cells. The loss of the fleet was classified as a high-cost failure, but Administratum archives attached a footnote suggesting the possibility that the Aeldari strike prevented a far greater infiltration scenario. In some cases, entire Aeldari operations appeared to focus on preserving specific individuals or artifacts, rather than territory or life. The Journost paradox, for example, occurred in 42nd millennium, year 12. An isolated death world within the Segmentum Obscurus suddenly became the site of a Craftworld incursion. A full warhost landed, occupied a 4-kilometre radius around a weathered stone monolith, and remained for 72 hours. No local population existed and no hostile force was present. Administratum surveillance eventually detected a lone Imperial archaeologist, Magos Tech Priad Genor, among the ruins. The Aeldari escorted him off-world, then initiated a scorched earth ritual that obliterated the site. Genor was later found on an Adeptus Mechanicus observation post with no memory of the event. The significance of the artifact remains unknown. The Administrator marked the event as Xenos intervention, protection of priority asset unknown to human interests. Despite the frequency of obscure and cryptic actions, certain themes became apparent in Aeldari behaviour. First, their operations often showed long-term predictive reasoning. In dozens of documented cases, Aeldari forces struck against emerging threats years, sometimes centuries, before the Imperium became aware of them. Second, their battles typically avoided unnecessary casualties. Though capable of mass destruction, they rarely utilised it unless provoked or in retaliation. Third, their forces operated with surgical precision and demonstrated complete environmental awareness, often making use of terrain in ways unfamiliar to Imperial tacticians. This consistency eventually led to the establishment of Codex Engagement Pattern A11, which advised that Aeldari forces be countered using elite strike teams, non-linear formations, and limited psycho deployment under close supervision. In terms of long-term impact, Administratum analyses identified several key strategic advantages the Aeldari held throughout their post-fall history. They retained mastery over the Webway, allowing for unpredictable troop movement and supply flexibility. Their psychic discipline, when controlled, surpassed that of Imperial psychers in both reliability and destructive power. Their technology, while aging and irreplaceable, continued to outperform most Mechanicus designs in speed, agility, and energy efficiency. Finally, their culture, fragmented though it may be, remained rooted in survivalist doctrine. While their numbers were low, every Aeldari engagement was driven by a strategic clarity few in the Imperium could match. The closing centuries of the 41st millennium left the Administratum with a sobering conclusion. The Aeldari would not recover their empire, but neither would they vanish. Though no longer dominant, they remained a permanent variable, one with the capacity to shift galactic events through timing, foresight, and brutal precision. Their defeats were rare, their victories precise, and their presence, while enigmatic, was never accidental. For every Imperial citizen who cursed them as traitorous Xenos, there were Inquisitors and Magi who understood the deeper reality. The Aeldari were not ghosts. They were warnings made flesh, echoes of a civilization that once ruled the stars and now walked among them as living memory, intervening only when the consequences of inaction became unacceptable. Their defeats were rare, their victories precise, and their presence, while enigmatic, was never accidental. For every imperial citizen who cursed them as traitorous Xenos, there were inquisitors and magi who understood the deeper reality. The Aeldari were not ghosts. They were warnings made flesh, echoes of a civilization that once ruled the stars and now walked among them as living memory, intervening only when the consequences of inaction became unacceptable. In the sealed records of the Inquisition, the Aeldari are not treated as a monolithic species of declining aliens. They are catalogued as a high-tier existential anomaly. Beneath the veneer of collected battle reports and Mechanicus schematics lies a far more disturbing understanding, one that positions the Aeldari not simply as survivors of a fallen empire, but as progenitors of galactic instability. According to Ordo Xenos Vault Entry 9 Null Sigma, the species' involvement with psychic manipulation, warp exposure, and causality interference predates the Imperium's formation by millions of years. The Inquisition holds firm to the theory that while chaos is the fundamental threat to reality, the Aeldari were the trigger mechanism by which it gained its most potent weapon, the birth of Slaanesh. Inquisition archives estimate the fall of the Aeldari occurred approximately 10,000 years prior to the beginning of the Great Crusade. This timing is significant because the shock wave of Slaanesh's creation directly influenced both the shattering of the Aeldari Empire and the collapse of the warp into a maelstrom of violent storms, now called the Eye of Terror. The Ordo Malleus classifies this event as a cataclysmic psychic implosion, and its effect was not limited to Aeldari space. Entire human settlements across the galaxy, those that predated the Age of Strife, recorded simultaneous psychic spikes, mass suicides, and warp entity appearances. In one such case, the lost colony of Borskalerin experienced what their surviving stone-etched logs described as a scream from beyond the firmament, louder than stars. The cause of this trauma was eventually linked to the same temporal coordinate as the fall. Among the more disturbing findings locked within inquisitorial memory vaults is the question of intent. While popular administratum narratives frame the Aeldari fall as a slow civilizational collapse into hedonism, internal Ordo Xenos researchers have speculated that elements within the Aeldari ruling castes may have anticipated the consequences of their spiritual degradation, but chose to pursue it anyway. This theory, called the voluntary annihilation principle, appears in Segmentum Pacificus Archive Codex Epsilon 9, based on analysis of surviving Aeldari temple ruins and pre-fall artifacts. The principle suggests that a small but influential faction of Aeldari may have sought to ascend through oblivion, believing that death, especially psychic death, was a conduit to transcendence. Whether this theory has merit remains inconclusive, but it is supported by the ritualistic designs found in temples recovered from shattered planets near the Eye of Terror. These carvings depict figures merging into starfire, being consumed willingly by warp flame. Not all Inquisition data concerns ancient ruins or esoteric symbolism. Contemporary engagements with Aeldari forces have revealed technologies and actions incompatible with standard Xenos behavior. One such case, classified under the codename Verdict Lamina, occurred in 41,000, year 419. A rogue trader vessel intercepted a seemingly derelict Craftworld fragment drifting in a stable orbit around a dead star. Upon approach, the crew suffered complete neural shutdown, including their onboard navigator, whose final message was a series of disconnected sensory impressions. High-frequency laughter, intense fear, and a sensation of being watched by a mirror that could not stop screaming. Death records listed all exposed personnel as having suffered complete warp burn. When inquisitorial teams later recovered a shard of Wraith bone from the site, it emitted residual warp echoes that matched low-level demonic speech patterns. The implication was clear: the site had been partially tainted, not by chaos itself, but by remnants of the fall that had never been cleansed. Further inquisitorial investigation has led to growing suspicion that Slaanesh is not entirely external to the Aeldari experience. Many Inquisition seers have noted the psychic resonance shared between Aeldari souls and warp entities aligned with the Prince of Excess. Although the Aeldari now take extraordinary measures to protect their souls, whether through spirit stones, soul-capturing rituals, or integration into Wraith constructs, the Inquisition maintains the belief that their species still emits a unique signature that attracts Slaanesh entities. Some Inquisitors even hypothesize that Craftworlds themselves act as resonance chambers, amplifying psychic frequencies that ripple through the immaterium. These concerns have only deepened with the emergence of the Ynnari and the partial resurrection of ancient figures, including the Phoenix Lords. The Ynnari's rise has been met with deep mistrust within the Ordo Xenos. While surface-level engagements show their opposition to chaos, internal reports describe a disturbing commonality between their psychic rituals and certain forbidden heretical psi-paths studied in pre-heresy Terran sects. In particular, Yvrane's resurrection abilities, executed in battlefields soaked in blood and surrounded by the dying, bear structural resemblance to the ablationist cults of Old Earth, whose members believed that death released an echo of divine consciousness into the noosphere. Inquisitor Castan Brule, formerly of the Order Malleus, submitted a classified thesis in 41,000, year 912, suggesting that Yvrane may not be resurrecting in the traditional sense, but rather recycling souls along a latent warp-bound vector. While this theory remains highly controversial, it has led to restricted observation orders for all Ynnari appearances across the Segmentum Obscurus. The Inquisition has also attempted to interrogate Aeldari prisoners. These efforts have met with extremely limited success. Aeldari captives, particularly Farseers or Warlocks, tend to self-terminate upon capture, using psychically induced neural shutdown or concealed energy nodes embedded in their armour. Those who do survive rarely speak and exhibit subtle forms of psychic manipulation, even while sedated or bound in null fields. During the Perron Span Purge, a captured Saim Han Ranger remained silent for over 2 weeks, before forcing an entire squad of Adeptus Custodes to experience a collective hallucination of their own deaths. The incident led to the immediate implementation of Silent Witness Protocol Theta, requiring all Aeldari prisoners to be confined within triple-sealed null cages, monitored by non-psychic servitor drones. Not a single case of full cooperation or confession has ever been logged. Despite these risks, some Inquisitors believe the Aeldari are necessary evils, tools of ancient design still capable of resisting greater darkness. There is evidence to support this position. During the Abraxas Null catastrophe, Ulthwé Seers successfully averted a warp incursion by redirecting a planetary alignment to destabilize a demonic breach. The local Order Malleus cell, despite witnessing the event firsthand, reported it as a geological anomaly. Internal logs show that this redaction was made not to conceal Aeldari heroism, but to prevent further questions regarding how they had known about the breach before it opened. At the heart of the Inquisition's unease lies a recurring pattern. The Aeldari always arrive too early or too late, but never by accident. They appear in moments of critical tension, navigate variables unknown to even the most advanced Imperial prognosticators, and manipulate events without explanation. Their continued survival, especially given their declining population, defies probabilistic models. Some Inquisitors believe that the Aeldari Farseers are not merely using prescience but are actively sculpting timelines, nudging events in subtle increments toward conclusions no human mind can perceive. Whether this constitutes benevolence, interference, or subversion is unknown. The Inquisition has long wrestled with a final heretical question, one which remains suppressed even within internal circles. Are the Aeldari trying to save the galaxy, or themselves? The difference is not semantic. If the Aeldari seek to preserve reality for all species, their interventions, however arrogant, might be justifiable. But if they act solely in their own interest, leveraging Imperial sacrifices as delaying tactics for their survival, then they are parasites with foresight. Powerful, elegant parasites riding the tide of a galaxy drowning in its own blood. For now, no conclusion is permitted to circulate. The Aeldari remain a restricted designation, classified above standard Xenos threats and forbidden from being referenced in public ecclesiastical sermons. All knowledge of their deeper origins, psychic potential, and philosophical structures is quarantined to Ordo-Xenos containment vaults, and used only when necessary to predict future crises. They walk the stars not as allies, not as enemies, but as a dying people obsessed with control, unwilling to vanish quietly, and unwilling to trust that anyone else might succeed where they failed. The earliest cross-faction confrontations involving the Aeldari and major powers of the galaxy are drawn from fragmented observations, many of which were only recompiled after the formation of the Ordo Xenos. Initial records were never meant to be compared, but across millennia, a consistent picture began to form. The Aeldari engaged with other Xenos civilizations and human forces alike with alarming strategic precision, neither in open conquest nor permanent retreat, but in sudden surgical interactions that seemed shaped entirely around the avoidance or provocation of very specific outcomes. One of the most notable examples remains the Ankara Avoidance Protocol, a classified operation in 40,000, year 267, when a Necron tomb complex on the world of Ankara Prime became simultaneously active with the sudden appearance of a Bieltan strike force. Imperial observers stationed nearby assumed the Aeldari were responding to the threat. Instead, the Aeldari destroyed several active tomb structures, ignored others, and sealed off one in particular before vanishing. When Necron forces emerged 3 days later, they bypassed the sealed structure entirely, suggesting prior awareness of its nature. Later Ordo Xenos analysis speculated that the Aeldari may have modified the site to trigger a controlled reawakening, manipulating both Necron and Imperial response times. The underlying objective was never discovered. The event was filed as high-complexity Psi-War interaction, xenotype Aeldari and xenotype Necron. Similar patterns emerged in encounters involving the Ta'u Empire. During the Damocles Gulf conflicts, the Aeldari were notably absent from major Imperial records. But the Inquisition possesses scattered fragments of battle telemetry, from Ta'u warships showing brief unidentified vessel appearances which share energy signatures with Saimhan and Ynnari craft. These vessels never engaged but appeared during crucial moments of Ta'u fleet redirection, often immediately before Ta'u forces abandoned expansion efforts near Exodite territories. Some inquisitorial analysts believe the Aeldari employed psychic suggestion or manipulated sensory data, subtly rerouting Ta'u interests away from high-risk locations. Others suggest back-channel negotiations may have occurred, possibly through Exodite intermediaries. No confirmed diplomatic meetings were ever recorded, but the Ta'u have consistently avoided Exodite worlds, a pattern they apply to no other Xenos faction. The working theory: the Aeldari do not see the Ta'u as a current threat, but as a resource to be preserved or used when the time is right. When it comes to the Orcs, the Aeldari have engaged with far greater aggression. Dozens of classified Inquisition reports indicate that Craftworlds treat large were formations not as conventional military threats, but as dangerous psychic infections. The Aeldari understanding of Orc Gestalt energy fields is centuries ahead of the Imperium's, and they act accordingly. In 41,000, year 638, during the Iloris massacre, Craftworld Aeldari launched a brutal strike against a rising Orc empire in the Golmor Drift. Instead of attacking fleet concentrations or known war bosses, they targeted PC harmonic nodes, Orc totems, breeding zones, and psychic amplifiers. Imperial agents observing the event noted 0 Aeldari losses and a total collapse of the Orc energy field. The Orcs themselves simply wandered off, their collective fury dissipated like vapour. The Inquisition filed the tactic under minefield disruption methodology, an action the Imperium has yet to replicate successfully. In contrast, when facing Tyrannid biofleets, the Aeldari have exhibited behaviour bordering on desperation. The most well-known incident was the defence of Craftworld Aeldari during Hive Fleet Kraken's Splinter Assault, but the Inquisition maintains deeper files on less publicised engagements. Notably, the Thrinna Cascade Defence, a joint operation involving Bieltan, Ulthwé and Ynnari forces, resulted in a manipulated redirection of Hive Fleet Gorgon. Through the use of psycho-reactive decoys and sacrificial warhosts, the Aeldari lured the swarm into a pocket of unstable space that resulted in mass bioform annihilation. This event, while successful, came at extreme cost. Psychic leakage from the area created a temporary warp echo, which later triggered demonic intrusions in a neighbouring Imperial system. Inquisitor Halvorn of the Order Xenos remarked in his sealed report that the Aeldari play with fire to quench fire. Their solutions often leave behind secondary catastrophes more subtle, but no less deadly, than what they prevented. Chaos incursions, however, provoke the most nuanced Aeldari reactions. While all known Craftworlds oppose chaos, their methods differ wildly, and sometimes contradict each other. Ulthwé, often seen intervening in Imperial defense efforts against demonic manifestations, operates with alarming foreknowledge. In multiple logged events, Ulthwé warhosts have arrived before any Imperial distress signal was even sent. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, in particular, is a recurring presence in Inquisition reports spanning over 5 millennia. Some Order Malleus agents believe he may have influenced early events leading to the resurrection of Robout Guilliman, though no official record confirms this. What is confirmed is that Eldrad has, on multiple occasions, acted to suppress or destroy chaos threats without informing Imperial forces, often in ways that interfere with ongoing campaigns. During the Zardoc Rift Purge, for example, Imperial Guard artillery was redirected mid-operation after Eldrad's interference, resulting in chaos remnants escaping a kill zone. Imperial commanders labelled the event sabotage. Ordo Xenos records list it as temporal realignment maneuver, with no further explanation. The Ynnari in particular raised deeper concerns among Inquisitors. While ostensibly fighting chaos, their theological framework, centred around the god Ynnead and the empowerment of death itself, borders on apocalyptic. There are several instances where Ynnari warhosts appeared during the death of Imperial saints, harvesting soul energy or collecting psychic remnants before vanishing. These events are not recognised in any ecclesiastical log but have been documented in Black Vault records under the codename Soul Shadow Manifestations. One incident involved the death of St. Lurian of Vostroya, whose relics were recovered without a soul resonance. The Ynnery was spotted days earlier in the same system. Inquisitors now theorise that they may be collecting soul energy as fuel for Ynnead, siphoning it from both enemies and allies alike. A rare but significant encounter occurred between the Aeldari and the Grey Knights during the Tranquility Moon incident. In 41,000, year 733, a demon world collapsed under pressure from a converging Inquisition-led purge. Grey Knight squads, en route to secure the breach, were intercepted by Aeldari Farseers who demanded their immediate withdrawal, citing that the planetary core contained a whisper from the time before gods. The demand was ignored. When the Grey Knights made planetfall, they encountered a warp entity that could not be banished through conventional rites. 3 squads were lost before the Aeldari arrived and enacted a ritual that imploded the entity's existence altogether. No further explanation was given. Surviving Grey Knights recorded the experience as chronologically inconsistent. Time within the demon zone had fractured. The Aeldari had somehow remained unaffected. Inquisitorial analysis flagged this as the most direct evidence yet that certain Aeldari factions possess temporal shielding technologies, or something worse. Encounters with the Leagues of Votan have been more ambiguous. While most Imperial documentation categorizes kin Aeldari relations as non-existent, Inquisition black files note at least 4 silent standoffs. In each case, both species encountered each other in proximity to Lost Old Ones ruins or ancient precursor artifacts. Neither engaged. In one particularly unusual case, a kin fleet commander was quoted unofficially as saying, "They walk like we remember things we've never known." The Inquisition considers it possible that the Aeldari and the Votan are drawn to similar remnants of ancient civilizations, possibly competing for forgotten technology or knowledge once held by the Old Ones. Whether this results in future collaboration or violence remains unclear. Across these confrontations, one disturbing trend has emerged. The Aeldari appear to choose who sees them. Imperial campaigns that log Aeldari presence often do so only because the Aeldari allow themselves to be seen. There are records of entire campaigns, some decades long, where subsequent inquisitorial review uncovered signs of Aeldari interference never reported by frontline forces. Changes in logistics, subtle misfires in planetary defences, or minor warp fluctuations often point to hidden psychic manipulation. These operations are referred to in the Ordo Xenos as silent hand protocols. At times, the Aeldari intervene with surgical precision. At others, they vanish during moments of dire need. Their selective assistance leads to a chilling conclusion. They are not acting as allies nor enemies, but as variable managers in a galaxy governed by collapse. They appear when the cost of inaction exceeds the price of involvement, and when they disappear, it is never due to fear, but because their part in the equation has ended. Among the most heavily restricted documents in the Ordo Xenos vaults are those categorized under Blackout Class Echo, files detailing interactions or observations that break consistency with known galactic mechanics. In nearly every instance, the presence of Aeldari psychers or artifacts coincides with environmental data shifts that resist logical correlation. Some of these cases are merely odd. Others suggest that the Aeldari are not merely surviving the galaxy's unravelling, but attempting to reshape its fabric even at the cost of coherence itself. One example is the Viridian Lens anomaly, first logged in 41,000, year 892. A monitoring station orbiting the decaying dwarf star Andrax 77 detected the sudden appearance of a massive wraithbone structure, suspended in vacuum without any visible anchoring. For 6 hours, the station's instruments failed to measure time accurately. Chronometers either froze or looped. Several servitors reported conflicting data logs, with one recording future entries and another looping through events already completed. Within the anomaly's radius, the concept of cause and effect began to break down. The Aeldari structure then collapsed in on itself and vanished. No identifiable warp signature was left behind. An Ordo Chronos agent assigned to the region described it as an experimental timeline regulator, though no official conclusion was published. The report was sealed under the codename Reverberant Knot. The Aeldari were never seen, but analysis of residual psychic trace confirmed their involvement. Another suppressed case involves the preservation chamber on Ural Thas, discovered by explorator teams during a failed colonization attempt in the 42nd millennium, year 37. Beneath the planetary crust, a subterranean structure of Aeldari origin was found containing 6 suspended humanoids, none of them Aeldari. Their armor, physiology, and gene markers all diverge from standard human baselines. 3 bore mechanical augmentations resembling early Dark Age of technology implants. 1 displayed signs of perpetual stasis-induced youth. Inquisitorial geneticists concluded that at least 2 of the individuals were not Terran in origin, but their precise species could not be confirmed. The chamber was powered by a sole reactive Wraith core that emitted constant low-level null energy, effectively masking it from warp-based detection. The purpose of the chamber remains unknown. The leading theory is that the Aeldari may have preserved specific individuals, not for study, but for reactivation at a future point along a predictive timeline. Whether these preserved figures were allies, tools, or warnings remains open to debate. Another deeply concerning discovery occurred on Cirthan Moon B, where a group of Aeldari farseers was observed conducting a mass ritual near a failed Imperial colony. Surveillance-picked feeds show no accompanying military presence, only 10 robed figures standing in a wraithbone circle surrounding a single human corpse. Analysis of the body's records revealed it belonged to a rogue psyker who had never left the planet. No interaction between the Aeldari and this psyker had ever been recorded. The body was found to have undergone reverse synaptic decay, as if its death had not yet occurred. Imperial agents moved in to interrupt the ritual, at which point all 10 Aeldari figures disintegrated into ash. No warp distortion was measured. The incident remains unexplained. A post-mortem conducted on the corpse revealed its soulstone cavity was empty, yet it still emitted a faint psychic resonance for 12 hours after death. the Order Malleus marked the case as chrono-warp psionic reversal and promptly buried it beneath 5 layers of security clearance. In another incident codenamed Thornglass Echo, Inquisitor Harnack Drell attempted to track a rumour concerning a living map, hidden deep within the Webway. After years of searching, he made contact with a Harlequin mask that agreed to escort him to a location described as the root of his question. He was never seen again. His data recorder, however, returned, deposited inside the Inquisition stronghold on Armathia Prime with no sign of breach. The recordings inside consisted of fragmented whispers in binary, Low Gothic, and Old Aeldari. When deciphered, they described events yet to occur, the loss of specific Imperial planets, the death of Inquisitor Soren Munt, and the partial awakening of a Necron AI in Segmentum Pacificus. All predictions came true within the next 8 years. The file was locked under psychic quarantine. It remains inaccessible, even to Lord Inquisitors. Suppressed observations of Aeldari soul technology raise further questions. Spirit stones, when studied in isolation, demonstrate basic soul containment capacity. But when integrated into a Wraithbone core or war construct, they begin to exhibit non-linear memory behaviour. One experiment conducted on a destroyed Wraithlord chassis retrieved from Cadia's surface revealed that its spirit stone emitted fluctuating psychic signals only during certain hours of the local solar cycle, as if attempting to resynchronize with a celestial condition no longer present. More concerning was the stone's reaction to human proximity. When approached by a psyker, the stone's signal spiked, mimicking the frequency signature of that psyker's childhood emotional state. Drawn involuntarily from memory, the Inquisition destroyed the artifact immediately and destroyed all lab personnel records. Notes on the incident suggest that Aeldari soul technology may not store memories, but emulates sentience through reflection, a psychic echo modelled on perception, not personality. If true, this would redefine current understanding of what a spirit stone contains. In rare cases, the Inquisition has even considered the possibility that some Aeldari Farseers are operating outside of linear time entirely. This theory, proposed by Inquisitor Keith Rowe, draws on evidence from 43 separate planetary conflicts in which a single Aeldari figure, matching the exact height, weight, facial features and vocal signature, was observed with no visible aging across nearly 8 millennia. This figure, presumed to be the same individual, appeared in events separated by thousands of years, often arriving alone, never speaking, and intervening only to preserve or eliminate a single key figure. In each instance, the target would either go on to commit significant future acts or, if removed, be replaced by someone more aligned with long-term survival probabilities. While no identity was confirmed, several Inquisition texts now refer to this entity simply as the Threadkeeper. Whether this is myth, fragmented memory, or an actual rogue Farseer operating beyond causality, the pattern is consistent enough to merit formal tracking. The darkest files, however, revolve around the Black Library, not the metaphorical one whispered in Terran archives, but the real construct. Located somewhere within the Webway, guarded by the Harlequins, the Black Library is believed to contain a total psychic record of every potential chaos outcome across every possible future. The Inquisition has made 3 known attempts to access it, either through direct infiltration or by negotiating with rogue Harlequin factions. Each attempt failed. The first ended with all involved agents being erased from historical memory as if they never existed. The second resulted in a temporal loop within the Webway, where the team relived the same 8 minutes repeatedly until psychic degradation killed them. The third attempt succeeded in sending a servitor drone inside, which recorded only a single phrase etched into Wraithbone. "You are not the story's owner." The drone exploded immediately after transmission. No further expeditions have been authorized. Among Inquisition leadership, the debate continues. Are the Aeldari holding the galaxy together by a psychic thread, or are they tightening a noose around it to preserve themselves at the cost of all else? Their tools are precision-based, but carry collateral. Their goals appear noble, but their methods remain untranslatable to human strategic doctrine. It is possible that the Aeldari are preventing worse fates, steering the galaxy away from total annihilation, but it is equally possible they are only postponing the inevitable, rewriting the terms of extinction until it better suits their own mythic prophecy. The final Inquisition consensus, buried deep in sealed conclave files, is chilling in its brevity. The Aeldari are not saviors, they are fragments of a broken god, rewriting time until they can forget what they've done. If that is true, then the Aeldari Empire never truly fell. It simply folded inward, vanishing into silence, memory, and manipulation. And in that silence, it continues to act, unseen, untrusted, and never truly gone. The final Inquisition consensus, buried deep in sealed conclave files, is chilling in its brevity. The Aeldari are not saviors, they are fragments of a broken god, rewriting time until they can forget what they've done. If that is true, then the Aeldari Empire never truly fell. It simply folded inward, vanishing into silence, memory, and manipulation. And in that silence, it continues to act, unseen, untrusted, and never truly gone.